A week has passed since President Lee Jae-myung was sworn into office last Wednesday. For more on the key takeaways from Lee's first week in office, we're joined by Professor Lee Hee-eun, Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Professor Lee, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me on the program.
So it's been a full week since President Lee took office. What's your overall assessment so far, and what would you say is the most notable difference compared to the former Yoon administration?
Well, I mean, we're sort of at a honeymoon period for the Lee administration. So, as we go through the initial weeks of his presidency, what we're seeing is some of him laying out sort of his agenda, but also, as you noted, the stark contrast with the President Yoon administration. So, I mean, what we see most notably is obviously he has, and his party has legislative control, so he can easily pass through legislation. And we saw this just recently, yesterday, with the Special Counsel Act in terms of the bills that were passed to investigate the martial law, as well as the former First Lady. So I think that's obviously a big contrast from the previous administration, which was often deadlocked and often President Yoon vetoed the National Assembly. But also, what we're looking at, too, is the focus on the domestic agenda, and particularly, as he's indicated with his appointments, really a desire to sort of spur the economy with more government spending. And so the fact that, we haven't seen a person being nominated for the Ministry of Finance, I think lends to this idea that the presidential office is going to take more control in the reins when it comes to economic policy, and particularly, again, maybe through some stimulus to the economy in terms of more spending in the economy, in terms of spurring the activities there. But also, what we're seeing too is, he's making a lot of statements contrasting himself with President Yoon in terms of how to approach North Korea. And so, as opposed to more confrontation, there's a real signal here that there's going to be more engagement. And lastly, in terms of the judicial branch, too, I think we're seeing a lot of talk, at least in terms of maybe some reforms there. And there have been talk about, the Supreme Court, as well as other institutions, judicial institutions, which the Lee administration seems to be, I think, targeting with respect to making changes. So I think we've seen in this initial week, anyway, a lot of signals to really a lot of changes that are going to happen in the next 5 years.
Right, indeed. And the presidential office says it will accept recommendations from the public before appointing key government officials, including those at the ministerial level. So do you think this could help reduce controversy surrounding the appointment process?
Well, I think it's certainly it's a PR move by the administration, because this is basically not something that's unheard of, right? Because in the past, there was really no public input when it comes to the appointment of these high-level officials, like the minister-level officials in the government. So I think the idea here is it's supposed to be more transparent, more public accountability, and there will be more direct input from the people with respect to these high-level officials. But I think one of the difficulties here is when you have such a process, as opposed to appointing people based on merit, in terms of their sort of background and their expertise in being able to sort of handle these different ministerial jobs, that maybe this becomes more like a popularity contest. And in fact, let's say the people want a certain person, but another person has been selected, and there's going to be a lot of questions then as to whether or not the appointment was and having such a process by having such public input, where if you don't select the person that the people have sort of chosen, so to speak, then there's going to be lots of issues about what's the purpose of this process if the public really doesn't have a real say. And this is just window dressing sort of on terms of dealing with this kind of issue. So I think there's a lot of questions here as to whether or not this is a real sort of proposal, as opposed to just being a PR stunt by the administration. So it remains to be seen as to whether or not the public will really have an input, and whether or not this is actually you're going to select the right people for the job when it comes to these kinds of important roles.
Right, and like you said, a lot of changes to the judicial branch and plans to dramatically expand the Supreme Court have sparked controversy here in Seoul. What's your take on increasing the number of justices?
Yeah. I mean, this is a conversation that was being had even before, President Lee took office, particularly in terms of the cases that were being brought against President Lee, current President Lee now, of course, who was then running as a candidate for the office. And as we know, he was facing a number of criminal trials, and the Supreme Court basically, affirmed one of the overturned a high court decision that sort of denied guilt, but sort of reinstated essentially sort of a guilty sort of verdict, which was never confirmed at this point. But anyway, the Supreme Court was involved in that, and as a result, the reaction, I think, with respect to sort of the idea of court packing or significantly increasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court, I think runs the risk of really politicizing the courts and the judicial branch. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that the judicial branch shouldn't be political. It should be absolved from any political sort of influences and appearances of political bias. And so I think this potentially presents a real kind of problem because the more justices that you have on the court, and the idea is that that's a direct reflection of the political sort of reality of what's going on in politics in Korea today, whereas the court itself should not be a political body, but should be a legal one and should be objective and not swayed by political views or biases. And so I think that the danger here potentially is with adding significantly more justices, you're going to potentially then politicize the whole judicial branch. And I think this becomes problematic because then the trust in the judicial branch will become much less because they view it more like a political institution as opposed to a legal one. So I think it remains to be seen as to the reality of whether or not this will actually go forward. But in any event, I think this will be one of the big issues early on in this administration as to whether or not this will actually go forward in the future.
Right, and like you mentioned, President Lee is also facing several trials, but two have been postponed indefinitely, with the court citing Article 84 of the Constitution. Could you briefly explain what Article 84 exactly is and share your legal analysis on this issue?
Right. So Article 84 of the Constitution basically gives the president, the sitting president, immunity from any criminal prosecution while he's president, with the exception of, as we saw in the past, with respect to President Yoon, insurrection or treason. And so now the big question really was, because there were ongoing trials, criminal trials against, in the past, against candidate Lee or Representative Lee of the National Assembly, who now, of course, is the president, whether or not those ongoing criminal investigations and criminal procedures and trials should go forward, because the Constitution itself is silent on the issue as to ongoing trials. Now, certainly no new criminal trials or prosecutions can go against the president while he's the president. But in this case, because we had pre-existing trials and prosecutions, whether or not those could necessarily be suspended while he's the president. So I think what the current approach, and I think this is the more conservative one actually, is that when someone is sitting as president, those criminal trials should be basically stayed. And what a stay basically means is a delay until the person, in this case the president, no longer is the president, and then theoretically, after the president leaves office and becomes a civilian again, then the criminal trials can proceed. So I think that's really the question is, because the Constitution is silent on the question about previous trials, whether or not this case, the president now can be immune from prosecution. I think it's pretty clear at this point that there's at least will be a stay in the proceedings, and then what remains to be seen is what happens after he leaves office. So for the time being, there's no real threat of the President Lee facing any criminal jeopardy when it comes to his current criminal trials.
All right, Professor Lee, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
It was a pleasure joining you.